you guys ready to sing tonight? Jerusalem? Yep, we can sing Jerusalem. I think I got the same thing.
Right there next to you.
Thank you.
You're
Why is that? Yes, she is.
Ready? See him in Jerusalem, walking where the crowds are. Once these streets had sung to him, now they cry for murder. Such a frail and lonely man, holding up the heavy cross. See him walking in Jerusalem, on the road to save us. See him there upon the hill, hear the scorn and laughter. Silent as a lamb he waits, praying to the Father. See the King who made the sun and the moon and shining stars. Let the soldiers hold and nail him down, so that he could save them. See him there upon the cross, now no longer breathing. Dust that formed the watching crowds takes the blood of Jesus. Feel the earth is shaking now. See the veil is split in two. And he stood before the wrath of God, shielding sinners with his blood. See the empty tomb today, death could not contain him. Once the servant of the world, now in victory reigning. Lift your voices to the one who is seating on the throne. See him in the new Jerusalem. Praise the one who saves us. Lift your voices to the one who is seating on the throne. See him in the new Jerusalem. Praise the one who saved us. Praise the one who saved us. Amen. Okay, welcome everybody. Thursday night Bible study, Deep Calls to Deep, here at Friendship Bible Church. We are studying through the book of Judges, and we are in Judges chapter 15 today, moving right along. So before we get started, let's ask the Lord's blessing for tonight's study. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for everyone who's come out today to study your word with us, not only here in the church, but at home as well. And just pray that hearts and minds are open to your word as we study through the life of Samson. though he was a man of many faults, it is very encouraging that you could use him no matter what he did. And it really gives us encouragement that even though we be full of many faults, you use us as well, Lord, and you bless us and you watch over us as your children. So we're just so thankful for this book. We're thankful for the lessons that we can learn throughout the first 14 chapters, Lord. Just bless tonight's study and guard each heart and mind tonight as we look into your word. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, everybody should have read Judges chapter 15. Read ahead, as usual. And hopefully I'll answer most of your questions tonight as we go through the text. If not, don't be afraid to ask questions. Okay, comments? So before we get started in chapter 15, let's review last week. So last week we studied Judges chapter 14 and Samson's misadventures with a Philistine girl from Timnah. This is a town about 4 miles from his hometown of Zorah. As you can see up on the map, okay, you have Zorah here, and then as you travel west towards the Mediterranean Sea, about 4 miles is the city of Timnah, or the town of Timnah. It's really not a city. Now he, for reasons that we don't know, we're just not sure why he traveled to Timnah. He went to Timnah, and at some point in time, he spotted a girl that was pleasing to his eyes. And it was lust at first sight. So, after returning home, he demanded that his father get him this girl for a wife. Now, his father then set up a meet between him and his wife, Samson, the girl, and her parents. Now, on the way down, Samson and his parents separated. This may have been by his parents' insistence in order to have Samson avoid walking through a vineyard, which was on the outskirts of the town. Now, even though it is a Nazirite vow says to avoid drinking wine or grape products, probably walking through a vineyard, they wanted to be careful here. That's the idea here. So when they separated, Samson was attacked by a lion. Now, he killed and tore this lion limb from limb as easily as one might tear a goat. Now, I explained last week that I probably would have problems tearing a goat myself. I would probably need something a little smaller. So that's impressive no matter what, even if you tore a goat, I would think. Now, this strength was given to him by God as it was the Spirit of the Lord that came upon him. The author makes it clear that's where his strength in this particular instance came from. So after this visit, he let his father know, after speaking to this woman for a little bit, that he wanted this girl for a wife. He was still pleased with her. Now, last week we looked at how time passes between verses 7 and verse 8, which was no doubt probably the betrothal period. So, on the way down to claim his bride, Samson separated from his parents again, probably at the same spot. You go that way, we're going to go that way. We want you to avoid the vineyard. And he actually went to look for this lion carcass. Well, much to his delight, honeybees had formed a nest inside the carcass of the lion. Now, this is more than likely during the summertime where the dry heat would have kind of mummified the lion carcass. We talked about that a little bit last week. Well, much to his delight, honeybees had formed a nest inside the carcass of the lion. Now, there was nobody in the Holy Land at this point in time that raised honeybees. There was no honeybee hives. There was no beekeepers. So this was kind of a rarity in the Holy Land. So he reached inside the dead carcass and he scooped himself out a large amount of honey. The problem was that a lion was an unclean animal. And in this case, it was a dead, unclean animal. His contact with the animal and the honey would have been in violation of his Nazirite vow. Now, to make matters worse, he shared the unclean honey with his parents, which would have made them ritually unclean. His parents never would have eaten the honey had they known its source, but it says that he kept that fact to himself with good reason. Snapshots. We get a little snapshot into the decision-making of Samson, the character of Samson here, I think. So he kept that fact back. He didn't tell him where he got the honey. Samson not only seems to have little regard for his Nazirite vow, but he also has little regard for the thoughts and feelings of his own parents. And it didn't just start here with the honey incident, but probably months before, as Samson put them in a very awkward position as their Nazirite son, with this great, incredible birth, insisted upon marrying a Philistine. But he didn't care. It's what he wanted. So anyway, after a betrothal period, Samson was responsible apparently for throwing a week-long banquet as the last part of this wedding ceremony. Now, he was given 30 attendants or groomsmen by his Philistine in-laws to help him with this banquet. And to entertain his guests, he proposes a riddle. But attached to this riddle was a wager that he proposed to his 30 attendants. Apparently, Samson needed a little action here, right? We talked about that last week. He needed a little action. Just wasn't enough to propose the riddle. Had to have a little bit of bet here. So he says that if they can solve the riddle within the 7 days of the feast, he will buy them 30 linen wrappings and 30 changes of clothing. But if they couldn't, they would have to buy him 30 linen wrappings and 30 changes of clothing. Well, Samson had no intention of losing this bet. So he used the lion and the honeybees as inspiration for this riddle. And after hearing Samson's riddle, they knew that they had been had. This was a sucker bet. There was no way that they could figure out this riddle, and it would have been a costly loss because clothing was very expensive. Very expensive. So even at one change of clothing, one linen wrap each, it would have been a costly loss. So after 3 days without coming close to a solution, they resorted to threats against the bride and her family. Now, they probably felt vindicated, as it was partly her and her family's fault for inviting them in the first place. So I'm almost positive they didn't feel bad. So she stepped up her pressure on Samson. As it says, she asked him for 7 days. I think probably the first 3 days it was probably just of her own volition. And then after day 4, she had a little bit of motivation, so she steps it up. Day 4, she cried, she moaned, she used all her womanly wiles on him. And finally on day 7, he relented and told her the answer. Well, then she went and told Samson's attendants. So with just moments to spare, as it says, before the sun went down on that 7th day, the men came to him and gave him the correct answer. Samson was no dummy. He immediately knew where these men had gotten their answer. His wife-to-be had betrayed him. So Samson went on a rampage. He left the party immediately. He traveled 20 miles to the Philistine city of Ashkelon and slew 30 men. If you want to have an idea where Ashkelon is, if you follow that green line off screen a little bit, you're going over to the Mediterranean Sea, and you're going over to Ashkelon, was over there, about 20 miles. He took their linen wrappings and changes of clothes. He then returned to Timnah. He dropped off the clothing to his attendants. He paid his bet out. And at the end of verse 19, it says that he went up to his father's house. See, to me, and this is very important, as I establish this fact, it kind of rolls into all the other kind of ideas I have about chapter 15. But I believe he never consummated the marriage or returned to offer explanation to his bride-to-be or to her parents. And he may have felt that they didn't deserve explanation after what happened. But this action, no doubt, was more than likely a huge insult. The girl and her family were probably left wondering, am I married or not? Are we going through? You can imagine on their end, they're just not sure how to take this. And they were left wondering. Now, I think, and when I start with I think, and I'll tell you, my opinions are probably worth a hill of beans. Okay? There they are. You want my opinion? I give you my opinion. In chapter 15, we'll give you my opinion based on my study. But if I say I think, it means I just think. I think that they waited until they were sure, at least in their own minds, that Samson was not ever coming back, and then they gave her to, which more than likely was probably his best man, in verse 20. And remember last week I talked about the best man could have been the original person, a Philistine friend, that invited Samson to Timnah in the first place to get a load of this girl. Again, that's another opinion. It's not in the text. And so that's where we left off with the parents of the bride-to-be giving her in marriage to what was probably Samson's best man, one of the attendants. All right, everybody good? All right, so let's pick up our story in Judges chapter 15. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first read the first 8 verses of chapter 15. Judges chapter 15, first 8 verses. Okay. But after a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it came about that Samson visited his wife with a young goat and said, I will go into my wife in her room. But her father did not let him enter. And her father said, I really thought that you hated her intensely, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please let her be yours. Samson then said to them, this time I shall be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. And he went and caught 300 foxes and took torches and turned the foxes tail to tail and put one torch in the middle between the two tails. And when he set fire to the torches, he released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines, thus burning up both the shocks and the standing grain, along with the vineyards and groves. Then the Philistines said, Who did this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he took his wife and gave her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, since you act like this, I will surely take revenge on you, but after that I will quit. He struck them ruthlessly with a great slaughter, and he went down and lived in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit more time in the very beginning of this chapter, because what in the world is going on here? What was Samson thinking? What were the parents thinking? What happened? And what is the deal with this young goat? Okay, and I'm going to give you my best effort to clarify as much as I can. And I'm just going to give you a couple of thoughts and also opinions of commentators and others. All right? So let's just take a look here. Now, there is no opinion here. The time of the wheat harvest is associated with Pentecost. Another word for the Pentecost is the Feast of Weeks. All right? It takes place around the end of May to early June. All right? So we just had Passover, right? From Passover, they count 50 days, 7 weeks plus an extra day. That's why it's called the Feast of Weeks. Pente means 50. So Pentecost is 50 days. So that's where the names come from. So that brings us, if we count about 50 days from today, it brings us to the end of May, early June. All right? And whereas Passover and early on right now would be the barley harvest, okay, Pentecost also is the wheat harvest. So just to give you an idea. The first harvest is barley, the second harvest is the better harvest is wheat. So after cooling off, Samson decides to go down to Timnah to claim his bride. That's what it seems like to me. Verse 1, he's going down to claim his bride. Therefore, we know kind of when he made this trip, end of May, early June, right? What we don't know is when the wedding feast took place before. Right? We're not sure. Now, if we use the lion carcass as a gauge, right, and the summer heat mummified it so that the bees could make their hive, right, then it probably took place no later than, let's guess, take a guess, my best guess is September. So if that carcass laid out in the hot summer, very, very dry heat, like Las Vegas, right, very dry heat, and it mummified, and maybe they wanted a beautiful fall wedding, right? Fall is a beautiful time for a wedding. So I'm going to say that my best guess is that it was probably a September, October wedding, October at the latest. So using that as my best educated guess, the time between Samson's betrayal when he ran off and returning here in verse 1 was at least 8 to 9 months. So even if we use the late date of October, you're getting into the 9-month mark. Now, I would rule out anything under 6 months. I think that's nonsense, and anything over a year is probably way too long. 8 or 9 months is my best guess. The bottom line is we're ruling out 2 weeks, we're ruling out 1 month, we're ruling out a couple of months. Samson did not return for a very long time. So in case you thought, oh, well, a month later. Now, it changes the whole context of the chapter, because if you get a 2-week, 3-week, month period, you can see where there's a problem here. Now, you go to 8 or 9 months, which I think is more the case here, and you start looking and saying, well, there's a different type of problem here in chapter 15. All right, so let's go with that. So that's one thing. Probably about 8 or 9 months he returned. Now, the key Hebrew word in chapter 14 and 15, I talked to you before about the Hebrew sages, the Hebrew scholars especially, want to paint Samson in the greatest light that they can. He was certainly a folk hero, and I think if we lived back in the time of the judges, the time of the kings, all the little boys and girls probably knew who Samson was. There's probably 150 stories that they probably knew about that was passed down from word of mouth that they shared with each other, things that we never even knew he did that is not in the Word, but was probably passed down. So, you know, he is a favorite. But what happens is they do this. They want to paint him in the best light. And so the center of this argument is the Hebrew word isha. Now, remember that we talked about the Ish Elohim, right? It's the man of God. Usually a prophet is considered Ish Elohim. So very simply, Ish means man, and Isha means woman, very simply. So when it says Ish Elohim, that's man of God. The male counterpart is Isha. Isha can mean this: woman, wife, or female animal, actually. While Ish can mean man, husband, or it can actually mean a male animal. Now, we talked about this in morning devotions, and it's very important to establish that in Hebrew, the context is everything. We have Hebrew words that have 1, 2, 3, or 4 different meanings based on the context. So the context determines which translation of the word is used in each passage, and you know, it's not really that crazy in a sense that it's usually very obvious. Like, you don't have to be a Bible scholar to pick the correct translation of the Hebrew word, right? It's not really that hard. So it's not that we have so many problems here in the Scriptures, even the Old Testament. No, it's really very obvious. Now, I have a problem with this, with those who want to show Samson was married, and that's fine if you want to, you know, go that route. But they use it to excuse his behavior and claim that he had every right to do what he did. That's basically what they say. So I have a problem with that. They want the word Isha to be translated as wife in every instance. And I have to tell you, I refuse to argue that point. And I refuse to argue that against the translation for the sole reason that if this woman was betrothed to Samson, then many would have referred to her as Samson's wife anyway. As you recall, if you've done studies, a betrothal was much more than our modern engagement. Although you could break off both, right? So But a betrothal was a promise. It was a contract of some sort. It was an original contract. So betrothal is deadly serious. So if they refer to this woman as Samson's wife, then that's fine, that translation. I wouldn't argue that point. Everybody understand where I'm going with this? So I wouldn't look at every single place and say, oh, this says wife, but I would translate it woman and then pick that out. Because remember, with all these things, the spiritual, right? The spiritual truths are always the same. They don't change the spiritual truths. But we're Bible scholars and we're Bible enthusiasts, right? So I just want to make sure that you know what's out there in case you want to go a little bit deeper here. So you got the Hebrew sages, the Hebrew scholars. They're trying to say everything. Where it's wife, he's the wife. I'm not going to argue that point. But this does not mean, whether you translate it a wife or woman, that they were officially married. There is an official marriage. There is an ending of this ceremony. And to me, you can translate the Hebrew word ishah as wife, all that you want in these chapters, but it does not change the fact that this marriage was never consummated. Now remember that consummation was equivalent, basically, to a signed marriage certificate in modern terms. Signed document. So according to the courts, the laws, and the in-laws, and whoever involved, the consummation was the official marriage certificate or document, although they did have official marriage certificates in Hebrew culture. But just understanding, the consummation was the last part of this marriage. So let's tackle the issue that some have proposed that indicates that Samson was a visiting husband. I talked about this last week. And again, I don't want to go too deeply in circles too much on this, but I want to talk a little bit about this visiting husband. See, there is an ancient Middle Eastern custom that is actually still practiced today called a sadikah, okay? It was, and it's still generally practiced by men who have no permanent habitation. I mean, you could argue that maybe he didn't live with his parents. Maybe Samson didn't have permanent habitation. So the wife in this situation is allowed to continue to live with their parents more or less indefinitely. It is considered a legal marriage, although one of lesser status. So it is illegal, it's considered a marriage, but it's down the rung. And a lot of scholars think that the sadikah is probably some evolution from that concubine in which a woman does live in the household or in the tent of the husband, but is not given a marriage certificate, literally. So, I mean, it's just guesses along these lines. So, a husband in this type of, this visiting husband is actually a jaz musarib. Jaz musarib, which means visiting husband. So what is interesting about this arrangement is that the husband is supposed to bring a gift each time he visits his wife. So it does involve a gift. And this gift does not have to be very valuable or very extravagant. It doesn't have to be the most expensive of things. A young goat here would actually fit the bill as it would be just enough to avoid insulting the family. In other words, it's not an extravagant gift, but a young goat was probably a prized enough animal that it would be enough that a visiting husband would bring in this case. So you see that this type of marriage and the behavior of Samson seems to line up. I'm going to expound on this. So in case you want to, am I saying that Samson was under this kind of sedikah? I don't know. But some people said it's pretty fishy that he brought a young goat, right? And they make that point, and there are those out there in the commentary world who believe that that's exactly what happened here. So what do I think in verse 1? As Samson returns after 8 or 9 months to this girl's house in Timnah with the offer of a young goat. So what am I saying? All right, so here's what I think. Remember, what I think is worth how much? A hill of beans. Okay, but I think that what I come up with is at least based on some truth, some background, some history, what we've gone over for the first 14 chapters, what I know of things. So hopefully this is an educated guess. Samson ran off in anger without consummating the marriage, and in anger he slew 30 Philistines. I think he returned to Timnah, and he probably made some sort of show of throwing these clothes at the feet of these men, and then he stormed off without saying a word to the Philistine girl or to his parents. That's what I think happened. I think that his father demanded to know what happened and was made aware of how his daughter betrayed Samson. I can imagine his father. What in the world happened? Who did this? I imagine the father knew that Samson killed the 30 Philistines, and I know that he probably got pretty much most of the story or all the story from his daughter. I think that he knew he slew the 30 men and why he did it. And I think in verse 1 he was being honest with Samson in these next verses, and that he may have been even, I believe he was even afraid of Samson at this point. So he was fumbling over himself. He was being truthful, and he was trying to placate Samson. I think he was afraid of him. Now, I think that if this Zedekiah marriage had any credence, right, then possibly Samson himself showed up at this father's door, hoping that he could talk this man into making a Zedekiah type of a marriage contract with him. That this man would let him have his daughter anyway, but under a marriage of a lesser status. So if there was a Zedekiah involved in all this, I think it was all in Samson's head. That's what I'm saying. I personally just can't imagine that Manoah would have negotiated this type of marriage for Samson. Okay, everybody good? That is basically my opinion about what happened here in verse 1. 8 or 9 months went by, he decided, you know what, I want her still. His anger burned out, he was feeling lonely, whatever happened, and he decided he was going to go down and he was going to negotiate. Notice that Manoah and his wife didn't go down with him. Went down himself. He had a present for the father, and quite possibly he could have had this Zedekiah in his mind. Now, there's some out there you'll read to say that he was just trying to appease the father, and that is certainly a viable option here. He brought the young goat to kind of make up for what he did, although a young goat wouldn't make up for really what he did in storming off, I don't think. But there is opinions like that out there, and they certainly have credence. Either way, the man did not let Samson go into her personal chambers because he explained that he already gave her to his companion or his best man for the banquet. Now, this father is from the hated, uncircumcised Philistines. He's enemies of God. But I proposed to you before that I believe that he was telling the truth. Even though he's the Philistine. He's the enemy. He's certainly not the hero. He really did think that Samson hated her and that he was never coming back. And remember, I think that when he stormed off, he found out from his daughter what in the world is going on, what happened here. She spilled the beans. She told him everything, and he probably wasn't very happy. And I think that he really thought Samson wasn't coming back, and it was a sign. Samson was not gone for a few weeks to clear his head, not even a few months. This would have created no small amount of embarrassment and shame on this family. Now, I want to talk about shame. I don't know if anybody has ever studied honor and shame societies. Shame was a very powerful part of Middle Eastern society. This culture is what some historians call a shame society. This means that any individual or family member at any given time was either under a state of honor or under a state of shame. God himself was certainly working these ideas out of his own people, since this idea of shame behavior was in conflict with his word. I mean, this is certainly not biblical. It's something that the Lord would have certainly been trying to work out of his people. But in the Middle East, you were either in a state of shame or in a state of honor. And that certainly comes in to this chapter here. A more modern example of this type of culture is found in Japan, if anybody has studied Japanese culture. That's why if they are shamed in battle, they kill themselves. I mean, I don't know modern Japan, but, back in this with the samurai. So if you are ashamed, you're either in a state of shame or you're in a state of honor. The point is, where I think that this comes into our context, is that the man acted within the culture and he attempted to remove the shame of the situation by not waiting too long before marrying off this jilted daughter to someone else and kind of correcting the issue. He's removing the shame. I find no reason to question this man's honesty, even though he was a Philistine. So I think that what the man said was honest, and he was trying to remove the shame and marry this daughter off because she was jilted and the family lost honor. It seems to go with that. You're going to go and you read commentaries, go back, and you're going to find all kinds of different opinions about this man's actions and what what his actions were. And again, you're going to find people who say that Samson was in the right here, and this man dishonored Samson and angered Samson, and Samson was in the right and this man was in the wrong. But I think the man was honest, based on my study. All right, so in verse 2, he offers Samson his younger daughter, no doubt in fear, to see if he can avoid another volatile situation. He knows the man killed 30 Philistines. He doesn't want any trouble. So he says that she is even prettier than his other daughter. Well, in verse 3, Samson once again decides that he was being slighted. So he was going to punish the Philistines as a whole. Samson's way of working here is if one small group of Philistines insult him, then all the Philistines were fair game. This thinking shows us what an anomaly Samson was. When I read these, what an anomaly the man was. What do I mean? You look at all these chapters as a whole. He seemed to regularly hang out in Philistine territory. He had a weakness for Philistine women while ignoring Hebrew women altogether, at least as far as we know. What he possibly could be up to by hanging out in Philistine territory, I couldn't guess, but I think he was up to no good. He might have even been partying. He might have had a great club scene there, the best bars. He had a weakness, yet he had this rather vast dislike for the Philistines as a group. Now, one might argue that this was because God was messing around in these affairs, or that Samson was responding to some sort of righteous impulse that God had placed within him. This is God's work, behind the scenes. Now, we have established that God was definitely causing this trouble between his people and the Philistines. But part of God's plan was using a man that didn't seem to care very much about God's law or God's will. Samson acted primarily in self-centered rather than God-centered manner, doing what was right in his own eyes. Therefore, Samson decides, not under the influence of God, on a cruel but a pretty inventive way to cause trouble. In verse 4, Samson captures 300 Sheol, which is translated as foxes in my NASB. I don't know if anybody else has another translation. So NASB has foxes. Now, this Hebrew word can be translated as jackals. Again, we have another Hebrew word with a couple of different translations here. Now, the idea here is that since foxes are solitary creatures and jackals hunt in large packs, it makes more sense that what Samson caught were actually probably jackals. We can't verify that, but a better translation is probably jackals. They say that catching 300 solitary foxes was next to impossible. They work alone. Now, after catching these, more than likely these jackals, he then bound their tails together in pairs, and then he tied a torch to them. Now, the jackals would have raced off in a panic, carrying these flaming torches behind them, setting the dry and ripened wheat fields on fire. Now, the shocks here that are mentioned, the shocks were the wheat sheaves that were piled up in heaps. So after they took the wheat down, they put them in kind of sheaves, they put them on the ground. They're called shocks. They're the wheat that was already harvested. So they're the shocks. They lit on fire, along with the standing grain, the stuff that hasn't been chopped down yet. All right? So you can imagine these fields on fire. Now, I am no great animal lover, but I can imagine how this story would bother animal lovers and activist groups. Many of these jackals would have either died or have been traumatized and badly burned by Samson's antics. God has ordained that no matter how we feel, that it is certainly important to be humane to all animals, whether we're an animal lover or not. What Samson has done here is downright cruel. Samson's revenge here destroys much of the area's wheat crops. In addition, olive trees were generally planted around wheat, so many of them would have been ruined. They are the groves mentioned here, more than likely olive groves. Lastly, the vineyards were affected, probably the same ones that Samson avoided early in his travels to Timnah. That vineyard was probably gone at this point. Now, one other interesting observation about this story is that we have no mention of the Spirit of God giving him the power to accomplish this act of vengeance. And the thought is that it might, although it's not 100% here, but it might indicate that Samson was operating under the influence of his own evil inclinations. Now, would God use this to accomplish his ultimate purpose? And once again, like a broken record, you bet. You bet he will. Was God the author of this behavior? No way. At least not in my book. There's no way he's the author of this type of behavior. This whole dilemma reminds me about what James wrote in James chapter 1, verses 13 to 15. And Mary, thanks for bringing this up last week, because we were talking about this, right? No one is to say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it's run its course, brings forth death. Now, tempting is to solicit to do evil. So we got to be very careful in this passage that you do not indicate that God in any way solicited Samson to do evil. So if you look at the burning of these fields or the killing of 30 Philistines as some way Samson's evil inclinations, he's a renegade, right, and these are wrong behaviors and actions, we cannot attribute those things to the Lord. He would never solicit Samson to do evil. So we have to balance here in these chapters to understand that even though this man seems to be doing all these horrible things, that God was in complete control as part of his sovereignty. He is allowing the things to occur because he's starting this trouble between the Philistines and the Hebrews. All right? So just be careful in these verses. God does not solicit Samson to do evil. He does it all by himself. So all of these personality traits and colorful actions and behaviors are not from God, and we just got to be careful that we don't attribute them to God. Everybody good? So in verse 6, some Philistines, probably consisting of some local farmers and local leaders who wanted to know who did such a thing. And because of Samson's reputation is starting to precede him, I can imagine that it didn't take long to identify their culprit. They probably know pretty quickly as Samson. Now, some say that verse 6 indicates that the Philistine locals felt that this father was hasty in trying to preserve his daughter's honor and was they were kind of saying that he was at fault in their eyes. So they went and burned down his house, killing this man and his daughter. The idea is you went and lit the house on fire with the daughter and the father inside. And thus, the townspeople knew that this father was wrong in what he did. And there's those who are of that opinion. But I believe the main reason that they did not want is the main reason they did this is they did not want to confront this very strong and volatile man, so they chose the easier prey. They went after the father and the daughter. I think it was just easier. These people had no interest in taking on Samson. So, Annabelle.
If this girl married the best man, why was she still living at her father's house? Why was she there? She should have been gone with her husband.
I thought about that too. Great thought. I don't think in the language, I don't think he meant that. I don't think Samson knew that she was gone. So Samson arrives at the house. He wants to go into the bedroom. I don't think the father was saying, you can't go in. She's right in her chambers. I think he was basically saying is you can't go into her chambers. She's gone. He may have just as well be saying that to him. Like, Samson, she's gone. I already married her off. So I would assume, and again, it is an assumption, that.
But she did get killed.
What's that?
She did get burned up.
That is true. Now, there could be a case in which they had that same sort of marriage, right? A sedekah, so that may be true. For some reason, I don't. The woman stayed with the parents, right? After the marriage, I don't know. I mean, it could be the fact that, Samson originally was going to marry her and stay on the premises like they were. I don't know.
Wasn't it the younger daughter that got burned up?
No, it was the other daughter. Yeah. So there could be, yeah. That's probably a good point. So it may give credence to the sedekah idea. I personally think that Manoah would not have, negotiated this kind of marriage for Samson. But again, I could be wrong on that as well. Maybe she was originally supposed to stay on her parents' grounds. Did anybody else have any ideas about that? That's a great point. One I actually escaped my notice, because that is obvious, right? The girl was actually on the grounds when they burnt the house down, and she was still with her parents.
So maybe the best man was a visiting husband and he wasn't home.
That could be the case as well. I think we're taking educated guesses at this point, right? Yeah, I definitely think that it was the woman, that the wife-to-be. It was not the younger daughter. It seems to indicate that. Yeah, great point. Anybody else? Yeah, I think that they, and again, I just think that they had no interest in taking on Samson, and it was just easier to blame this man for their troubles because it may simply have been more convenient and certainly less risky. So they went and burned the house down. Well, whatever their motivation was, it didn't work. Samson went on another killing spree and slaughtered these men ruthlessly, or in the actual literal word-for-word interpretation of this is ruthlessly as a leg on thigh. It's basically using brute force. It's actually a wrestling move. So no weapon is mentioned. So I'm thinking that Samson went and he actually killed some people with his bare hands. Basically, ruthlessly, leg on thigh. No weapons, hand-to-hand combat. Well, Samson satisfied his sense of justice. After he did this, he went down to the rock of Etam, no doubt to be left alone. I think he was done, just like he said. But the Philistine leadership, who has now probably gotten wind of all that Samson has done, they will not let this behavior stand. They will try to exact their own justice. So in the next verses, as we move on to verse 9, we're going to see Now, this was a local issue. Now the Philistine leadership is going to get involved in the situation. And that's what we have in verses 9 through 20. Now, if you look here, if you continue to go east, you see the Rock of Etam is more of in the rocky area of the eastern side here of the map. And that's they think it's around that part. So he went up kind of in the mountains, in the hills, and was in a rocky area. All right, so I think it was a little bit east of where he was. So let's read verses 9 through 20. Any questions about verses 1 through 8? Any comments about verses 1 through 8? All right. Then the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out in Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, "We have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." And they said to him, "We have come to bind you so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." And Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me." So they said to him, "No, but we will bind you fast and give you into their hands. Yet surely we will not kill you." Then they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. And when he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arms were as flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds dropped from his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. So he reached out and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, "With a jawbone of a donkey, heap upon heaps, heaps upon heaps. With a jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men." And it came about when he had finished speaking that he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he named that place Ramoth Lehi. Then he became very thirsty, and he called to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" But God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, so that the water came out of it. And when he drank, his strength returned, and he revived. Therefore he named it En-Hakkor, which is in Lehi to this day. So he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Good stuff. The Philistine leadership realized that they had to do something about this man Samson. So they sent a large group of trained soldiers, and they came north and east and camped at Lehi, which you see is over by the rocky area here on the map, okay, over to the east side of all that. Now, when the men of Judah saw that the Philistines camped out in force in and around the area of Lehi, they sent a delegation to question them as to why they were in their territory. After all, they were subservient to the Philistines, but they had good relations with them. They told Judah that the reason they were in Lehi was to bind Samson for what he had done to their people. Now, the Judeans no doubt would have heard rumors and probably knew exactly what had happened. Don't doubt that the leadership of Judah didn't know what was going on with Samson and the Philistines. They were probably well aware. So they made a deal with the Philistines that they would go find and bring Samson out to them at Lehi in exchange for this continued good relations amongst their people. So they were to take Samson, right? And once they handed Samson over, they were going to leave Judah's territory. Right? Take Samson and go. That was the deal they made. So the tribe of Judah sent 3,000 men. You wonder why. They weren't taking any chances. Because they knew Samson and respected his amazing strength. Imagine sending 3,000 men after one. Pretty large amount of people. Now, I've spent a couple of chapters harshly criticizing the actions and behaviors of Samson. I know I have. I've given it to him. But it is time for the tribe of Judah to share some criticism here. Verse 11 confirms the type of thinking that we have already discussed that is a major problem in the heart and minds of the people of Israel. Right? Samson, by his actions and behavior, Samson just ruined their day. His antics are causing a disruption in the peace that they unlawfully forged with the sworn enemy of their own God. They asked Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? Are you kidding me?" And they asked this question with complete sincerity. I don't think they know any better. They just don't at this point. For the first time in these chapters, I actually feel sorry for Samson, as his own countrymen are ready to just hand him over to the enemy for a bit of peace that God specifically forbids. I have a lot to say about Judah here. And all Samson is not right at all for the things that he's done. This is unbelievable. And yet they have no clue because the lack of instruction in God's word and syncretism and Canaanization and all the other things that befell them. It was the problem. And it left this lead tribe without wisdom. The scepter would not depart from Judah. This was the tribe that Messiah would come from. This was the most important tribe in Israel. This was a low point. This is a low point for Judah. As they betray Samson, they hand his countrymen over. Now, to their credit, they were up front with Samson and told him that they were going to turn him over to the Philistines. And they said it right off the bat. Samson's only request was that they not kill him themselves. They agreed, and Samson allowed himself to be tied up with new rope. You understand what the idea here is, a new rope. Right? An old rope becomes dry and worn, and I don't know if I could break some of the ropes that they put on Samson. I told you I need a squirrel. I don't have that much strength, but I could probably get through a small, old rope. A new rope was a little bit more, it still had its elasticity, and so it wasn't dry, moist, and very hard to break, really hard to break. So they tied him with new rope. When Samson arrived at Lehi, all tied up, the Philistines shouted for joy. So they shouted. Now, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him at this point. And in verse 15, he found the jawbone of a donkey and killed 1,000 Philistine soldiers with it. Now, it was important that it is a fresh jawbone of a donkey. Why? What would happen to an old jawbone of a donkey? Like the ropes, brittle, right? Okay, so the idea here with the ropes and the jawbone is that they were fresh, and that meant something. So that's why he could kill 1,000 men with it, and it didn't break or crack or fracture. I can imagine it probably cracked. Again, in verse 16, Samson seems to love his poetry. He was a poet a little bit, right? He loves his riddle and his play on words. This involves two English words that's translated as donkey and heap, right? So these two English words, they actually come from the same Hebrew root word of chamor. So whether chamor can mean donkey, it can mean heap. So there are times when one Hebrew word can mean two entirely different things, but what happens is it leaves the English translation as kind of nonsensical. So if you translate it word for word, you don't get the sense of it. So a commentator named Moffat put this forth as not as a word for word translation, but as like kind of like an equivalent to show you in a modern way what Samson was trying to say here, how he was trying to put this rhyme together. He says this. I thought it was pretty good. I put it in here. It's just one line. With the jawbone of an ass, I have piled them in a mass. You know. So I thought I sort of added that in there. But usually when you take Hebrew poetry and you try to translate the words, and it just doesn't come out, comes out a little nonsensical. The NASB that I have actually is a very good translation of verse 16. So let me go back to verse 16. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men. Probably sounded a little bit more fancy in ancient Hebrew, right? But what we're going to look at is, what does he mean? What was he referencing here in his rhyme? See, what happens is this is a play on words, and this play on words means it describes, right? Samson killed a bunch of Philistines, right? And after he killed a bunch of Philistines, he left them in a large pile or a heap. Then he went and chased down some more Philistines, killed a whole bunch of them, left them in a heap. Okay? So he chased down a bunch of Philistines and left them in large piles or heaps. That's what he's bragging about. He probably could have left several heaps or dead bodies by the time the day was done. So after this massacre, Samson named this place Ramoth Lehi. Now, Ramoth is the hill of, and Lehi is jawbone. Now, it was probably named after this adventure of Samson, so they named this place Lehi, jawbone, after the jawbone he took. And Samson named it Ramoth Lehi, the hill of the jawbone, or Jawbone Heights. The translation there, very fancy. So, probably found out that from Samson somehow and got that name and named that. Now, I'm asking this as an honest question. How many of you read verse 18 and rolled your eyes? Did you guys have a reaction when you read verse 18? Then he became very thirsty, and he called to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" I mean, did you read that? A little dramatic. I mean, Samson appears to be a man of great highs and lows, as he is wondering why God delivered him just to let him ultimately fall in the hand of the enemy. Now, I will say that Samson was no doubt very thirsty and tired after this fight. And because of it, there is also no doubt that he was actually very vulnerable at this time. If the Philistines sent reinforcements, he would not have been able to defend himself. He was in those kind of dire straits. I don't think Samson was being overdramatic in that sense. I just kind of rolled my eyes when I read that. Mary, do you want to say something?
Well, when I read it, I thought about the Israelites in the wilderness and their attitude. The same thing, you brought us out.
That is true.
Just to have us die of thirst.
Just to have us die of thirst. And we're going to see a repeat occurrence from the children of Israel. Did you pick that up when you read it? Yeah, so we have a kind of a parallel passage here with Samson and the children of Israel, right? So I just wanted to make sure you knew, because I pick on Samson so much, that he probably was very vulnerable. And if they attacked in force, he probably would have been killed. So he was vulnerable. Samson does get props here, for he acknowledged that the Lord in his time of need, and he acknowledged that the Lord gave him, and he gives the Lord credit for this victory. He acknowledges the Lord here. That's a good thing. And we don't always have Samson doing that. And it seems like when Samson gets at the most dire need, that's when he turns to the Lord. And we're going to see that a little bit later, next week, actually. So he is giving God credit for the victory. And of course, we know that no matter what, we know that God's got this, right? He doesn't have his end for Samson here. So in verse 19, God, as he's done in the past, he split a hollowed rock, or literally the Hebrew translation is mortar, but he's up there in a rocky area there, so we're talking about a rock face that was split to bring forth water, and this revives Samson. And as before, this place became a landmark in Israel. At the time of the writing of the book of the Judges, people knew where this battle took place and the location of this hollowed rock that Samson called En Hakor, or the spring of the caller. Samson being the caller, the spring forth.
So when we go to the Holy Land, we're going to look for this.
I've got to wonder. Actually, I didn't check that. I didn't do my homework on that, so I apologize. I don't know if they know. I know at the time of the writing of the Judges, they knew where it was, but do they know where the Rock of Etam is there nowadays? I have going to say that I think it was lost to history, probably. But certainly in the time of the judges, or the writing of the judges, remember he talked about the writing of this book, it's probably occurred during the reign of David, his early years. If that was the case, the people of that time, of the early kings, knew where this place was. And I can imagine Samson being a folk hero, huge, huge folk hero. The crazy things that he did, wrong or not, would have been of legend. And so probably some of these places. And we see this before, right? Where do we see before there is a place? Was it Gideon's altar? Wasn't it? Is that where it was? Where Gideon sacrificed? Right? So we see in the past and here and earlier in Judges where there's some landmarks that were, places that people visited even during the time of the kings. But that's a good question. I do not know whether they know where this place is to this day. I can imagine no, but that's just off the top of my head.
I have a note that the well of him who cried. And you have
The spring of the caller. The spring or the well, it could be translated spring or well, of the caller or the crier. And it basically the idea is Samson cried out to the Lord, and the Lord provided a spring of water. He was saved, his thirst was quenched, and he was able to revive. Samson judged Israel for 20 years during a time of Philistine oppression. And the idea here is, we're not given a time stamp. I think this is just a general idea that probably from the first of his calling, when he started, to the very end that we find at the end of chapter 16, that was 20 years. We don't know in and around where this took place, maybe in the middle of the 20 years. Samson's judgeship was so hard to look at and to just kind of see or put into a box because it was so unique. He never judged or ruled over anybody, never led an army in battle. A lot of these judges, right, they fought a battle, they won, they retired in their hometown, and if you say the battle occurred, in the first couple of years of their judgeship, then 38 years they spent in their hometown and relaxed and enjoyed the benefits of being a judge. Very easy. But with Samson traipsing around here, and he doesn't lead men, there's no battle. We have 20 years and about 3 chapters. And we probably have so many stories and so many other things that he did that probably, it just, would fill up so many more chapters. This is what the author chose for us. All right? Any questions over the first, or actually, I should say, any questions over chapter 15?
Just reading, when I was reading it, a couple of things that reminded me in chapter 3, in verse 3 or 2, it says, "Is not her younger sister more beautiful than her? Please let her be." Remind me of Laban and Isaac.
Right.
With the younger sister.
Right. That was Rachel and Leah.
Rachel and Leah, exactly.
Right.
So when I read that kind of, and then when he killed with the jawbone, reminded me of Shamgar.
Shamgar, that's right.
The ox goad.
Yeah, the ox goad, the makeshift weapons used against the Philistines, right? Yeah, that's good. And again, we talked about that. We talked about the rock, right? The striking of the rock.
Yeah,
the Lord bringing it, right?
Also, yeah.
Very good. It's good reference and good. Yeah, this is not the first time the Lord has done this. Did this for Samson. And it's the same idea. Good. Chapter 15. Now, I do want to, before we go anywhere, I do want to go over the first 3 verses of chapter 16. So we're going to go to chapter 16. I just want to do the first 3 verses because I want to go right into Samson and Delilah next week.
And just one real quick, DG.
Okay.
The other thing that, when they said, "Are not the Philistines rulers over us?" The tribe of Judah.
Right.
When they said that, I was...
They're supposed to be the kingly line, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be the kingly line, right? They're supposed to be the lead tribe here. And we talked about it before. That's why I didn't go over. We talked about the syncretism. We talked about the making peace treaties. And boy, it's been going on hundreds of years. And we talked a little bit about a couple chapters ago, where we talked about how this is during the time of Jephthah. Remember, Jephthah he rises up and he defeats Ammon. We have nobody handling or dealing with the Philistines. and we have nobody crying out from the southern tribes for deliverance. And what does that tell us? We're here, 50 years later, 40 years of oppression here. 20, 30 years later, nobody has cried out to the Lord. Samson's raised up not because, most of these judges were raised up because somebody cried out to the Lord and the Lord raised up the judge. But nobody cried out to the Lord and the Lord raised up Samson. So that makes that was a very unique aspect of Samson's judgeship. But there's nobody in Judah who's crying out to the Lord. Why? Because they're just content having the Philistines as their neighbors, and if they give up a few cities here or there, and Philistines encroach on their land, as long as they have peace. It's not a big deal. So they were content. It was okay with them to be subservient to the Philistines, in direct violation of what God wanted for them. How many times in our life are we like the tribe of Judah, where God has blessings for us, but we're just content with where we are, right? When we put that in as an application. And we're not going to reach or strive for all that God has for us. Well, we're only human. That happens. Yeah, good point. All right, so is everybody okay for a couple more minutes? All right, do a couple more minutes. We'll go over the first 3 verses. Very easy. And next, that brings us right to Samson and Delilah next week. So let's see. We have this one little 3-verse story here. It says, now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. And when it was told to the Gazites, saying, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. And they kept silent all night, saying, let us wait until the morning light, then we will kill him. Now Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the city gate and the 2 posts and pulled them up along with the bars. Then he put them on his shoulders and carried them up to the top of the mountain, which is opposite Hebron. What's that?
Iron Man competition.
I was thinking about showing, I watched the Samson and Delilah movie like that, just that clip. I said, I want to really see what it looked like how they portrayed it. Everybody sees the Samson and Delilah movie? Probably a good a portrayal of what happened. So we begin chapter 16 with Samson once again traveling into Philistine territory and to a Philistine city. Probably up to no good. Why was he doing this? We do not know how much time has passed since the massacre at Lehi or why he was traveling to Gaza in the first place. Gaza was at the very south, so if you go all the way along to the Mediterranean Sea and you go south, that's where Gaza is. Gaza is the southernmost Philistine city. So what in the world was Samson doing all the way south? Samson, although having disdain or at least very little love for the Philistines, seemed to have an affinity toward their culture. And it's the only thing I can think for their bars, their clubs, the drinking, the culture is why he went. I can't imagine it's in any business venture. Samson had developed quite a reputation, so there were probably no Philistines who didn't know who he was. So after being seen, he's seen, right? He's entering into the place where a harlot was. Now, this is probably the same place, probably like an inn, kind of like Rahab the harlot. We studied that, right? We looked at that before. Rahab the harlot was probably an innkeeper, and she had an inn that was on the walls of Jericho. So what Samson did is after arriving in Gaza, he probably went into the local inn and enjoyed a prostitute. Now, really a modern example, or a more modern example, is what the modern, well, not modern now, but the saloon, right? The Old West, right? You always had the saloon and the bar downstairs, and you had the prostitutes upstairs. So I think it's the same kind of idea here. So he goes in there, and they surround him. So Samson had developed, upon seeing him go into this harlot, some men of Gaza decided to wait for him to come out in the morning and then kill him. That's the idea. These Gazans surrounded the place where Samson was staying. Sorry, I read that. He must have sensed that something wasn't right. We don't know why he got up at midnight, but he got up at midnight for some reason. But instead of maybe sneaking out of town, which wasn't Samson's style, I don't know if him getting up at midnight threw their plan off and it threw them off. Maybe some of them were sleeping thinking he'd get up in the morning. Maybe I don't know. Maybe Samson came out of the saloon and snuck to the city gates. He sensed danger. Again, we're not really told what happened. So he goes up at midnight, goes right to the city gates, and probably in awe, it must have just been an amazing sight as they beheld this gaping hole in the city's defensive wall, and especially as the sun came up. So maybe they just were awed by his strength. They were going to kill him, but goes to the city gates. He rips these city gates up off its hinges and walks off. Now, just an idea of city gates. City gates were made of large, heavy wooden planks that were put together, sometimes using iron spikes and sheeting, some iron sheeting on the gates as well. So it wasn't just the heavy wood, but there was some iron here. In other words, no mere human would attempt to lift these gates. But Samson just didn't dismantle his gates. He didn't just break the lock. Got to understand, why was it locked? Well, at night, you lock the city gates, right? So nobody could come in and nobody could leave. This is midnight. So they're not like locking him in or anything. They would have automatically locked these city gates. He went up to these locks, broke the locks, took these city gates, put them up on his shoulders, and just barreled his way through and out into the night. That's what he did here. And he carried them up to a hilltop or a mountain. And it says in the NSAB that he carried them to this mountain that was opposite Hebron. And just to close here, the Judean city of Hebron was about 40 miles away from Gaza. And the travel up over, because you're now going east, you're going from the lowlands over to the highlands. That trip to Hebron was it's a 25,000-foot elevation from Gaza to Hebron. 2,500. I said 25,000. Yeah, 2,500 foot. Yeah, 25,000. Way too. So yeah, 2,500-foot elevation. So he's going uphill anyway. And the idea here is that Samson probably dragged these gates down a road leading to Hebron, not all the way to Hebron, but probably on the road leading to Hebron, and probably arrived at a hill that probably had a view of Hebron in the distance, is the idea here. All right? So either way, it was an amazing feat of incredible strength. And so Samson, once again, avoids danger, avoids trouble this time, doesn't kill anybody, surprising, and he escapes the city. And next week, we're going to see what happens with him and Delilah, right? His weakness. Philistine women, right? Philistine women was his weakness. And this one's going to get him. All right, let's close in prayer, close our study tonight. Does anybody have any other questions or any comments about tonight before we end? Nope. They're very good tonight. It's like amazing. It's a great study and astute minds here. So it's a privilege to teach all of you because got a lot of Bible lovers, Bible enthusiasts, and it really comes out in the way you study and read and ask questions. So thanks for your kind attention. Let's close in a word of prayer, Lord. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for each one that came out tonight, and thank you for those at home. Just thank you for your word. Thank you for Judges and all the things it teaches us about you and about your people and how you handle things, and just providing these great applications for us to take throughout our week and apply in our own lives. Lord, help us to be not unlike the Israelites at this time who didn't know your word, but help us to be students of the word so that we can learn much more about you and so that we know the things that we should be doing week after week, month after month, year after year, Lord. Just give us the strength in your word and the things that we study, Lord, each one here and each one at home. Just bless their week.